It was July 2020 when I pulled into the RV park just outside Amarillo, Texas. The world was in chaos, but here, in this tiny forgotten corner, it felt like time had stopped. Or perhaps it had been abandoned altogether. The park wasn't much. A handful of RVs scattered unevenly, their owners likely drawn by the low fees and the promise of quiet. The air was heavy with humidity, the remnants of a recent storm clinging to every surface. Thunder still grumbled in the distance, a low, menacing growl that never seemed to fade. The office/diner sat near the park's entrance, its faded sign barely legible. Rosa's Diner. The paint peeled like old scabs, and the windows reflected nothing but the encroaching night. Something about the place immediately felt off, though I couldn't pinpoint why. Maybe it was the way the light flickered inside, or how the shadows didn't seem to follow the natural rules of movement. I parked my RV at the far end of the lot, away from the others. Solitude had been my goal for this trip, after all. As I settled in, I noticed an odd silence around me. Not the peaceful quiet of nature, but a suffocating stillness. No crickets, no distant hum of highway traffic. Just the sound of my own breathing and the faint tapping of rain dripping from the RV's roof. An hour or so later, hunger got the better of me. I wasn't in the mood to cook, and the thought of a greasy burger from the diner didn't sound half bad. Grabbing my wallet, I stepped outside and immediately regretted it. The air felt wrong. It pressed against my skin like a weighted blanket, damp and electric. The storm was gone, but the sky was unnaturally dark. No stars, no moon, just an oppressive black void that swallowed everything. I hesitated, scanning the empty lot before forcing myself toward the diner. The closer I got, the worse the place looked. The neon "Open" sign buzzed weakly, casting a sickly green glow over the cracked pavement. Inside, I could see a single figure moving. A waitress. She seemed to glide more than walk. Her movements too smooth, too precise. My instincts screamed at me to turn around, but I ignored them. Hunger, or maybe stubborn curiosity, pushed me forward. When I stepped inside, the first thing I noticed was the smell. Not the warm, greasy aroma of diner food, but something cold, metallic. The kind of smell you would find in a hospital morgue or a room that hadn't been aired out in decades. "Welcome to Rosa's," the waitress said, her voice smooth and oddly melodic. She was young, maybe mid-20s, with a sharp bob of black hair and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She wore a vintage-style uniform, pristine and out of place in such a run-down building. I glanced around. The diner was empty except for her. The counter stools were torn, the booth stained, and the floor bore the grime of countless forgotten footsteps. Yet, she looked immaculate. "What can I get you?" she asked, sliding a laminated menu in front of me. Her hand brushed mine, and it was ice cold. Not cool, not clammy. Cold. Like touching a metal pole in winter. "A burger and fries," I muttered, trying not to stare. Coming right up. She moved to the kitchen, and I watched her. Something about the way she walked, floated, set my teeth on edge. Her footsteps made no sound on the old tile floor. I shook it off, telling myself I was imagining things. The stress of the pandemic, the isolation of the road. It was messing with my head. But when she returned with my plate, I couldn't ignore it any longer. The food looked perfect. Too perfect. The burger was glossy, the fries golden and crisp, like something out of a commercial. But the smell was all wrong. No savory aroma. Just that same cold metallic scent from earlier. "You're not eating," she said, tilting her head like a curious bird. Her smile was wider now, stretching just a little too far. I am not that hungry after all," I lied, pushing the plate away. Her expression didn't change, but the air around me grew heavier. It felt like the walls were closing in, the shadows deepening, stretching toward me. "You should eat," she insisted, her voice no longer melodic but sharp, almost a growl. I stood abruptly, mumbling an excuse about needing to get back to my RV. Her eyes followed me, unblinking as I stumbled out the door. Back in my RV, I locked the door and shut the blinds. Heart pounding. I tried to rationalize what I had just experienced, but my thoughts were a jumbled mess. Then, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The diner. From my window, I could see it clearly. The neon sign was off now, the building completely dark. But what chilled me to the core was the realization that there was no power line running to it. The diner shouldn't have had electricity. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face. Pale, smiling, and wrong. My heart raced as I replayed the events, trying to make sense of them. My brain screamed at me to leave, to drive away and never look back. But my body felt frozen, as if some unseen force rooted me to that spot. Around 3 a.m., I heard it. A faint tapping on the RV door. I shot up in bed, my throat dry and my skin damp with sweat. At first, I thought it might be the wind or a stray branch, but the sound was too deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. A rhythm, slow and steady. For a moment, I didn't move. I couldn't. The silence outside was absolute, swallowing everything except that infernal tapping. Gathering my courage, I crept to the door, careful not to make a sound. My hands trembled as I peeked through the small window. No one was there. The lot was empty. The shadows of the other RVs stretching unnaturally long under a light that didn't seem to have a source. I let out a shaky breath and backed away, telling myself it was just my imagination. But as I turned, my blood turned to ice. The tapping started again. This time, on the side window. I whipped around, and for the briefest moment I saw her, the waitress. Standing just outside, her face pressed against the glass, her lips stretched into that grotesque smile. Her eyes were wrong, glassy and lifeless, yet locked onto mine. I stumbled back, knocking over a chair. By the time I looked again, she was gone. Panic surged through me. I grabbed my keys, ready to start the engine and get the hell out of there. But when I opened the blinds to check outside again, my heart nearly stopped. The diner was lit up, bright, garish neon spilling into the night like a beacon. The windows glowed with an eerie, pulsating light, and inside I could see movement. Shadows, dozens of them, shifting and writhing like a mass of bodies crammed together. I blinked, and the shadows were gone. The diner looked empty again, but the light remained, cold and unwavering. I couldn't stay. Grabbing my keys, I flung open the door and bolted for the driver's seat. The engine sputtered to life, and I slammed my foot on the gas, peeling out of the lot so fast I nearly lost control. The road stretched ahead, endless and dark. My hands gripped the wheels so tightly they ached. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see her face. But all I saw was the diner, its glowing sign shrinking into the distance. Or so I thought. After what felt like an hour of driving, I saw it again. Rosa's Diner. The same flickering neon sign, the same dilapidated building, sitting just off the road like it had been waiting for me. No, I whispered, my voice trembling. No, no, no. I hit the gas harder, speeding past it. But my stomach dropped when, 5 minutes later, it appeared again. It didn't make sense. I hadn't turned around. The road was straight and unbroken. Yet, there it was. The third time I saw it, I slammed on the brakes and skidded to a stop. The RV shuddered, the engine wheezing as I sat there, staring at the diner. My breath came in short, shallow gasps. The air inside the RV felt thick, suffocating. Then, I saw her. The waitress stood in the middle of the road, her figure illuminated by my headlights. She wasn't smiling anymore. Her face was twisted in a grotesque mask of rage. Her eyes black pits that seemed to pull the light from the world around her. I couldn't move. Her mouth opened, impossibly wide, as if she were screaming, but no sound came out. Instead, the air seemed to vibrate, a low hum that grew louder and louder until it felt like my skull would split open. I slammed the RV into reverse, tires screeching as I backed away. But as I looked behind me, I realized it didn't matter. The diner was there too. Surrounded. No matter which direction I turned, there it was. Rosa's Diner, glowing and eternal, a nightmare made real. The shadows in the windows moved again, pressing against the glass like they were trying to escape, or trying to get to me. The hum grew louder, deafening now, and I felt something cold and sharp brush against my neck. I whipped around, but the RV was empty, or so I thought, until I saw the condensation forming on the inside of the windows. Words. Stay for dinner. I don't remember much after that. I must have blacked out because the next thing I knew, I was waking up in my RV parked on the side of a highway. The sun was rising, and the diner was gone. At least I thought it was. When I looked at my hands, they were stained with grease and something darker. Blood. And on the passenger seat was a plate, a burger and fries. The smell was cold and metallic. I stared at the plate for what felt like hours. The burger looked wrong, too perfect, like a prop from a staged photograph. The fries were cold, congealed in a shiny layer of grease. But the worst part was the blood. It pooled under the plate, sticky and vibrant, dripping slowly onto the seat beneath it. My stomach churned. I threw the door open and stumbled out of the RV, gasping for air. The highway stretched empty in both directions, nothing but asphalt and barren plains. The diner was gone, but its presence lingered, pressing down on me like an invisible weight. I tried to piece together what had happened. Had I imagined it? A hallucination? A nightmare that somehow bled into reality? But the blood on my hands and the plate in the RV told a different story. I needed to get out of there. The RV sputtered reluctantly to life, and I drove, aimless and frantic, until I saw the first sign of civilization. A gas station. I pulled in, my hands shaking as I stumbled inside. The clerk, a middle-aged man with a cigarette dangling from his lips, glanced up from his magazine. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said with a smirk, but his expression shifted when he saw my face. "Are you okay?" he asked, his tone serious now. I don't know," I stammered. "There was a diner. Rosa's Diner. It's back that way." "Do you know it?" His face went pale. The cigarette fell from his lips. "Rosas?" he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've got to be kidding me." I shook my head. I don't know how to explain it. Something happened there. Something... "You shouldn't have stopped," he cut in, his eyes darting around as if he expected someone, or something, to be listening. "Rosa's burned down years ago. A fire. Killed everyone inside. No one's been near that place since, but I was just there." I insisted. "I saw it. I talked to the waitress. She..." He held up a hand, his face a mask of fear. "Don't say any more. Just leave. Get as far away from here as you can." "But leave!" he barked, his voice trembling. I stumbled back, the weight of his words sinking in. My heart pounded as I returned to the RV, my thoughts racing. If the diner burned down, what had I seen? Who, or what, was the waitress? I didn't wait to find out. I drove for hours, putting as much distance as I could between myself and that cursed stretch of highway. But even as the miles passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. A week later, I was back home, trying to put it all behind me. I scrubbed the RV clean, desperate to erase any trace of that night. But the nightmares didn't stop. Every night I saw her, the waitress standing at the foot of my bed, her lifeless eyes boring into mine. And every morning I woke up to the smell of grease and blood. I tried everything, therapy, sleep aids, even moving, but it didn't matter. She followed me. Then, one night, I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. On my bedroom window. When I looked, she was there, smiling. This time, I didn't scream. I didn't run. I just stared, paralyzed as she raised one hand and pointed at the door. A sound came from behind me, a low hum, like before. And then, I smelled it. Burgers. Fries. When I turned, my heart stopped. My living room had changed. The furniture was gone, replaced with red vinyl booths and a linoleum floor. A flickering neon sign buzzed above, casting everything in an eerie glow. Rosa's Diner. The waitress was behind the counter now, watching me. Her smile widened as she slid a plate toward me. "Dinner's served," she said, her voice hollow, echoing in the empty space. The shadows began to move again, creeping closer. And I knew. I was never leaving. I have never been one for ghost stories. I always chalked them up to superstition or overactive imaginations. But what happened to me and my wife at Palo Duro Canyon last fall changed everything. I haven't told many people about it, mainly because I don't want to relive it. But maybe writing it down will help. We had been planning the trip for months. Rachel, my wife, had been dying to take the RV out for a weekend, and the weather was perfect. Palo Duro Canyon was supposed to be breathtaking that time of year. Crisp autumn air, burnt orange foliage, and just enough chill at night to make campfires worthwhile. We pulled into the campground late Friday afternoon. The sun was dipping below the canyon rim, casting long shadows over the rugged terrain. There weren't many other campers around, just a few scattered RVs and tents in the distance. It was peaceful. Almost too peaceful. The kind of quiet that makes you hear your own heartbeat. Rachel and I set up our site, grilled some burgers, and sat by the fire as the stars blinked into the darkening sky. The wind whispered through the canyon walls, carrying a faint, distant echo that seemed to shift direction every few moments. Rachel joked that it sounded like someone humming. I brushed it off, told her it was probably just the wind playing tricks. By midnight, we crawled into the RV, both exhausted from the drive and a little buzzed from the wine. Rachel fell asleep almost instantly. I lay awake, listening to the sounds outside. The crackling fire had dwindled to glowing embers, and the hum of the wind was now punctuated by something else. Footsteps. At first, I thought it was an animal. Maybe a coyote or a deer sniffing around the site. But the sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic. It circled the RV, slow and steady. Gravel crunched under each step, one after another, like someone pacing. I didn't want to wake Rachel. She had a tendency to panic, and I figured it would pass. But after 15 minutes of that slow, relentless circling, I couldn't take it anymore. I quietly slid out of bed, grabbed the flashlight, and peeked through the small window by the kitchenette. Nothing. The firelight barely reached the edge of the RV. But beyond that, there was just darkness. I opened the door, stepped outside, and shined the flashlight around the site. The beam cut through the night, illuminating the trees and the empty picnic table. Still, nothing. The footsteps had stopped. I stood there for a few minutes, waiting for anything to emerge from the shadows. But the only sound was the wind scraping against the canyon walls. Finally, I locked the RV and climbed back into bed, telling myself it was just my imagination. I woke up to Rachel screaming. She was standing by the RV door, her hand trembling as she pointed at the window. The glass was smeared with handprints, long, pale smudges that stretched across the entire pane. Dozens of them. Some small, like a child's. Others larger, more defined. But they were everywhere, crisscrossing in patterns that made no sense. "Did you do this?" Rachel's voice was barely above a whisper, but I could hear the terror in it. "Why would I do that?" I snapped, stepping closer to inspect the prints. They weren't ours. The smears were greasy, almost translucent, as if the hands that made them were damp. I pressed my palm against one, measuring the size. It was larger than mine by at least an inch. I checked the door. Locked. Same with the windows. There was no sign of forced entry. Whoever had left those prints had done it from the outside. But there were no footprints in the dirt beneath the window. Nothing. Rachel wanted to leave immediately. I can't blame her. But I convinced her to stay, at least until sunrise. We spent the next few hours huddled together, every creak of the RV making us jump. When the first light bled over the canyon, I stepped outside again. The handprints were gone. Not just faded or washed away. Gone. As if they had never been there at all. Rachel swore up and down that she hadn't imagined them, and I knew better than to doubt her. We packed up and left that morning, cutting our trip short. Weeks passed, and we tried to forget about it. But Palo Duro stayed with us. Rachel refused to camp anymore, and I started triple-checking the locks at night. Sometimes, when the wind picks up, I hear footsteps outside our house. I tell myself it's nothing. But some nights, when I look out the window, I swear I see faint smudges on the glass. They're not there in the morning. It was May 2021 when I decided to camp by Lake Mead. I don't know what drew me there, not really. Maybe it was the vague memory of a childhood trip, the image of the water shimmering in the desert heat, or the way it felt like the kind of place where the world couldn't touch you. But what I do know is that I wish I'd never gone. The RV rattled and groaned as I maneuvered it down the dirt path leading to the lake. The landscape around me was barren, almost hostile. Scraggly bushes and jagged rocks dotted the terrain, and the air felt heavier than it should have. It wasn't just the heat. It was something else. Something I couldn't quite place. Like a shadow looming just outside your peripheral vision. By the time I reached the lakeshore, the sun was already sinking behind the horizon, its red-orange light spilling across the water. The lake stretched out before me, impossibly vast, its surface unnaturally still. It wasn't peaceful. It was dead. The moment I stepped out of the RV, the silence hit me. Not the kind of quiet you would expect in a remote place, where you might hear the occasional chirp of a bird or the rustle of wind through the trees. No. This was a silence that pressed against you, that seemed to suck the sound out of the world. Even my own footsteps felt muffled as I walked to the water's edge. I stood there for a while, staring out at the lake. There wasn't a soul in sight. Not a single boat, no other campers, nothing. It didn't make sense. Lake Mead was supposed to be a popular spot, wasn't it? The thought flickered through my mind, but I brushed it off. Maybe it was just an off-season thing, I told myself. It was as I was heading back to the RV to set up camp that I saw him. A man, standing on the far side of the clearing, just where the dirt path disappeared into the shadows. He wore a tattered jacket and a wide-brimmed hat, the kind fishermen might wear to shield themselves from the sun. But his face was what caught my attention. Or rather, the lack of it. The light was fading fast, and his features were obscured, like they were wrapped in shadow. But his eyes seemed to gleam unnaturally, reflecting the dim light in a way that wasn't right. "Evenin'," he called out, his voice carrying across the clearing like a whisper that somehow felt louder than it should. I froze, a primal unease washing over me. I hadn't heard him approach. There was no crunch of gravel, no rustle of movement. He was just there. "Evening," I replied, forcing my voice to sound casual, though my throat felt dry. "You camping out here?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. "Yeah," I said. "Just for the weekend?" He nodded slowly, his head bobbing like it was on a loose hinge. "You fish?" "Sometimes," I said. He pointed a long, bony finger toward the water. "Good spot just past the bend there. Big ones." There was something off about the way he said it, like he was reciting lines in a play he didn't fully understand. I nodded, muttered a quick thanks, and turned back toward the RV. When I glanced over my shoulder, he was gone. Despite the unease gnawing at me, I decided to check out the spot he mentioned. Maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe it was the kind of curiosity that gets you killed in bad horror movies. Either way, I grabbed my gear and followed the shoreline toward the bend he'd pointed to. The path was narrow and uneven, the kind of trail that feels like it's been forgotten by time. The further I went, the darker it got, the moonlight barely piercing through the thickening shadows. When I finally reached the spot, I saw what he meant. The water here was deeper, darker, its surface like polished obsidian. I cast my line and waited, the silence around me feeling heavier with each passing minute. That's when I heard it. A faint splash, like something breaking the surface of the water. I squinted, peering out into the darkness. At first, I saw nothing. But then, movement. A ripple, subtle but deliberate, cutting through the still water. And then, I saw him. The fisherman. He was out there, standing waist-deep in the water, his wide-brimmed hat unmistakable. His head was tilted back, as if he were looking up at the sky, but there was something wrong with his posture. His shoulders were rigid, his arms hanging limply at his sides. "Hey!" I called out, my voice shaky. "You all right?" He didn't respond. I took a step closer, my boots sinking into the soft mud. "Hey!" I shouted again. And then he turned. But it wasn't a normal turn. His body twisted in a way that made my stomach look right. Like his spine was bending in directions it shouldn't. His head snapped toward me, and even from that distance I could see his eyes. They weren't reflecting the moonlight anymore. They were glowing. I don't remember running back to the RV. It's all a blur. Branches clawing at my arms, the ground slipping beneath my feet, the sound of my own ragged breathing drowning out everything else. When I finally slammed the door shut behind me, I locked it and collapsed against it, my heart hammering in my chest. The silence had returned, but it wasn't comforting. It was suffocating. I peered out the window, my eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of him. The clearing was empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the RV, every whisper of wind against the metal shell, set my nerves on edge. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps outside, but when I mustered the courage to look, there was nothing there. The next morning, I drove into the nearest town, desperate to shake the unease that clung to me. I stopped at a small diner, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone. Over a cup of bitter coffee, I mentioned the fisherman to the waitress, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes. Her face paled. "Lake Mead's been closed for months," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do you mean, closed?" I asked. "Since the accident," she said. "A boat capsized out there last year. They never found the guy who went missing. Fisherman named Paul wore a wide-brimmed hat, always fished the same spot near the bend." I felt the blood drain from my face. "What happened to him?" She shrugged, her expression grim. "Some say he drowned. Others say he's still out there, looking for someone to take his place." I didn't finish my coffee. I didn't even say goodbye. I just left. The image of the fisherman burned into my mind. I haven't been back to Lake Mead since. I sold the RV, moved to a different state, and tried to forget. But sometimes, late at night, I dream about the lake. In my dreams, I am back at the water's edge, the silence pressing down on me like a weight. And in the distance, I see him, standing waist-deep in the water, his glowing eyes locked onto mine. And then, I wake up, drenched in sweat, the sound of his voice echoing in my ears. "Good spot past the bend there. Big ones." And I know, deep down, that one day, I will hear that voice again. But next time, I won't wake up. Some nights, when the world is quiet and the shadows seem to stretch a little longer than they should, I hear his voice soft, close, like he's standing right behind me. "I know what you did, Lucas. I know everything. It has been 8 years, and I still wake up drenched in sweat, my throat raw from screaming. I don't know if what I saw was real, but I know it was something I was never supposed to encounter. You can tell yourself all you want that ghosts aren't real, that people who vanish into thin air are nothing but stories to scare kids. But if you'd been with me on that dark stretch of road near Pismo Beach in September 2016, you wouldn't be so sure. Let me take you back to that night exactly as I remember it. My family and I had been driving up the California coast for days. The RV rattled and groaned with every mile, the engine making a sound like it didn't want to be there any more than I did. It was supposed to be a peaceful, twistle trip. Jenna, my wife, thought it would be good for us. A chance to recharge, she had said. And Adam, our 8-year-old son, loved the idea of sleeping in a house on wheels. Me? I just went along with it. The trouble started late, around midnight. We had parked the RV on a quiet pull-off a few miles outside of Pismo Beach. It was one of those lonely stretches of road, with cliffs on one side and black ocean on the other, the kind of place where headlights only find emptiness when they cut through the dark. I had stepped outside to smoke a cigarette, leaving Jenna and Adam asleep inside. The wind was colder than it should have been for September. It carried the sharp scent of salt and something else I couldn't place. Something metallic, like rusted iron. As I stood there, staring out into the inky black of the ocean, I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate. A rhythmic crunch of gravel under boots. I froze, my cigarette hanging from my lips. I hadn't heard a car pull up, and there was no one else around for miles. But the footsteps kept coming. I turned around, expecting to see some late-night traveler, maybe another camper. Instead, I saw him. The hitchhiker. He was standing a few feet away, silhouetted against the RV's dim yellow light. His face was obscured by shadow, but I could see enough. He was tall, lanky, and his clothes hung off him like they didn't quite fit. A tattered gray hoodie, ripped jeans, and boots that looked like they'd walked through hell and back. His hands were shoved into his pockets, his posture oddly still, like he was trying not to scare me. "You got a light?" he asked. His voice was low, rough, like he hadn't used it in years. I swallowed hard, trying to shake off the creeping unease crawling up my spine. "Yeah, sure." My hands were trembling as I pulled out my lighter and flicked the flame to life. The hitchhiker stepped closer, just enough for me to see his face. His skin was pale, almost gray, like he hadn't seen sunlight in months. His eyes. God. His eyes were what I remember most. They were too wide, too bright, and the irises seemed to shimmer in the light, like oil floating on water. He grinned a slow, unnatural smile that didn't reach those shimmering eyes. "Thanks, Lucas." I froze. My heart stopped mid-beat. "How do you know my name?" He just stared at me, unblinking. That horrible grin still stretched across his face. I took a step back, my mind racing. Maybe he had seen the RV. Maybe Jenna or Adam had mentioned my name earlier. That made sense, didn't it? But deep down, I knew there was no way. Jenna and Adam had been asleep for hours. "It's a nice family you've got in there," he said, nodding towards the RV. "Jenna and Adam, right?" I dropped the cigarette, my pulse thundering in my ears. I could feel the blood drain from my face. "Who the hell are you?" He didn't answer. Instead, he took a slow step forward, his boots grinding against the gravel. The wind picked up, whistling through the cliffs, but I swear it sounded like whispering low voices carried on the air, speaking words I couldn't understand. I stumbled back toward the RV, fumbling for the door handle. I wanted to run, to slam the door in his face and pretend I hadn't just spoken to something that shouldn't exist. But when I looked up, he was gone. Vanished. There was no sound, no footsteps, no movement. Just the empty stretch of road and the wind screaming through the dark. I climbed back into the RV and locked the door behind me, my hands shaking so badly I could barely twist the deadbolt. I stood there in the dark for what felt like hours, listening, waiting. The wind howled outside, and the RV creaked in response. I turned to check on Jenna and Adam, half expecting to see that hitchhiker standing over them, but they were still sound asleep. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the driver's seat with my eyes fixed on the rearview mirror, watching for any sign of movement. Morning came slowly, the sun creeping over the horizon like it didn't want to be there either. I convinced myself I had imagined the whole thing. That maybe I had been too tired, or maybe the darkness had played tricks on me. We packed up and hit the road early. Jenna was in good spirits, humming along to some song on the radio, and Adam sat in the back, flipping through a comic book. I kept my eyes on the road, my fingers white-knuckled on the steering wheel. Every so often, I would glance at the side mirrors, half expecting to see that pale face grinning back at me. And then I saw him. We were halfway to Monterey, driving through a long stretch of empty highway, when I caught a glimpse of something in the distance. A figure standing by the side of the road, his thumb stuck out in that universal hitchhiking gesture. It was him, the same gray hoodie, the same two wide eyes. "Lucas!" Jenna's voice made me jump. I glanced over at her, trying to hide the terror on my face. "Yeah? Did you see that guy back there?" My mouth went dry. I nodded. "Yeah, I saw him. He looked weird, didn't he?" I didn't answer. I didn't answer. I couldn't. We drove on in silence, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still there, watching us. That night, we stopped at a crowded RV park near Monterey, surrounded by families and laughter. It should have felt safe. It didn't. I woke up around 2 a.m. to a faint tapping sound. Tap, tap, tap. It was soft, like fingernails against glass. I sat up, my heart pounding. The RV was dark, Jenna and Adam still fast asleep. I listened, straining to hear over the blood rushing in my ears. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the window. I turned my head slowly, the air feeling thick and heavy, like I was moving underwater. He was there. The hitchhiker stood just outside the window, his face inches from the glass. His skin was paler than before, almost translucent, and his grin was wider. Too wide. His teeth were sharp and gleaming, like a predator that had finally cornered its prey. I told you, Lucas. I know everything. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I just sat there, staring into those impossible eyes as the tapping continued. Tap, tap, tap. And then he was gone. The next morning, I told Jenna we were cutting the trip short. I made up some excuse about work, but I think she could tell something was wrong. I didn't care. I just wanted to get out of there, to put as many miles as possible between us and whatever that thing was. We made it back home in 2 days. I thought that would be the end of it. It wasn't. 2 weeks later, I found a photograph tucked under the windshield wiper of my truck. It was a picture of the RV. Our RV parked on that lonely pull-off near Pismo Beach. In the corner of the photo, you could see a figure standing in the shadows. The hitchhiker. That was 8 years ago. I moved my family to a different state. I changed my job, my routines, everything I could think of to shake the feeling that he was still out there, waiting. But every so often, I catch a glimpse of something. A figure by the side of the road, or a shadow where there shouldn't be one. And sometimes, late at night, I hear it again. Tap, tap, tap. And I know he's still watching. My name is Ian Matthews, and I need to tell you what happened to me in August 2022. It's not just a memory. It's a shadow that clings to me, a nightmare that won't let go. I'd rented an RV and booked a campsite just outside Bar Harbor, Maine. The idea was to escape my city life and recharge in the serenity of nature. I imagined hikes through Acadia, starlit nights, and the kind of quiet that heals the soul. But the quiet I found wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating. The RV park was small, tucked into the edge of a forest that seemed older than time. My spot was near the tree line, where the shadows stretched long, even during the day. The first afternoon was unremarkable. I set up camp, made a quick dinner, and sat by a small fire, listening to the rustle of leaves in the breeze. It started around 10 p.m. A sound. Low, rhythmic, almost indistinct. At first I thought it was the wind groaning through the trees. But no, it was sharper, more deliberate. Creak, creak, creak. It sounded like old wooden wheels turning on uneven ground. My first thought was that someone was hauling something. A wheelbarrow or an old cart. But as I sat there, straining to pinpoint the noise, I realized it wasn't coming from the nearby campsites. It was coming from the woods. I stared into the darkness, firelight flickering weakly against the trees. "Hello?" I called out. My voice seemed to vanish, swallowed by the stillness. The creaking stopped. I waited, frozen, listening. A minute passed, then 2. Just as I started to convince myself I'd imagined it, the sound returned. Closer this time. Creak, creak, creak. My chest tightened. The fire, once comforting, now felt inadequate, its light barely reaching beyond my immediate surroundings. I doused it quickly, plunging myself into darkness. Inside the RV, with the doors locked and the curtains drawn, I tried to convince myself it was nothing, a trick of the wind, a distant camper. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The next day, I decided to ask around, casually at first. Most of the other campers brushed me off. One older man chuckled and said, "You're just hearing the trees settling. Happens all the time in old forests." But when I mentioned it to Dale, the campsite manager, his expression changed. He paused, his hand gripping the edge of the desk. "You sure you heard it?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "Wagon wheels, right?" He didn't answer at first, just stared at me with this hollow look. "Finally," he muttered. "Sometimes people hear things out here. Just stay close to camp, okay?" Then he walked away before I could press him further. That night, I made sure every curtain in the RV was shut tight. The creaking began earlier this time, around 9 p.m. Faint, but persistent. I stayed inside, gripping a flashlight, trying to ignore it. But ignoring it didn't work. By midnight, it was louder, closer. Creak, creak, creak. And then, something new. A thud. A single, heavy thud, like something being dropped onto hard ground. My breath hitched. It came again, louder this time. Thud. Creak! Thud. Creak! I couldn't stay inside anymore. My skin prickled with a horrible certainty. Whatever it was, it wouldn't stop until I faced it. I stepped outside, flashlight trembling in my hand. The air was cold, unnaturally so for an August night. The camp was silent, the other RVs dark. "Who's there?" I called, my voice cracking. The sound stopped. I scanned the tree line, the flashlight beam shaking as I moved it back and forth. The woods loomed, a wall of blackness that seemed to pulse with menace. Then, I saw it. A shape. Low to the ground, barely more than a shadow, but unmistakably moving. It was gliding between the trees, almost too smoothly, like it wasn't walking but being carried. And behind it, I could make out the faint outline of a wagon. The wheels turned slowly, creaking with every rotation. But there was no one pulling it. I froze, unable to look away. The figure stopped at the edge of the woods, just outside the beam of my flashlight. It tilted slightly, as if noticing me, and then it laughed. Not a laugh exactly, but a sound that mimicked one. Dry, hollow, and mechanical, like bones scraping together. I stumbled back into the RV, locking the door and pulling the blinds shut. For the rest of the night, the creaking circled the campsite, punctuated by the occasional thud. The next morning, I decided I'd had enough. I packed up to leave, but as I drove toward the exit, Dale was standing there, waving me down. "You leaving?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "What the hell is out there?" I demanded. He sighed, looking older than he had the day before. "This place, it's got history. Used to be a settlement here, back in the 1800s. They say a family disappeared. Their wagon found abandoned in the woods. No one knows what happened to them. Or at least, no one talks about it." I stared at him, waiting for him to say more, but he just stepped back and waved me on. That night, I stayed at a small motel in Bar Harbor. I didn't care about the cost. I just needed walls around me, something solid between me and whatever was out there. But around 3 a.m., I woke up to a sound. Creak, creak, creak. It was outside the motel, louder than ever, echoing up to my second-floor window. My heart pounded as I approached the curtain, every instinct screaming at me not to look. I peeked through a crack. In the parking lot below, the wagon was there, its wooden frame warped and splintered, the wheels turning slowly on their own. And standing beside it was the figure. No longer a shadow, but something wrong. Its body was twisted, its limbs bending at unnatural angles. Its face, or what should have been its face, was a void, a shifting blackness that seemed to pull the light around it. It raised a hand, long and thin, and pointed directly at me. I left Bar Harbor before dawn, driving until the sun was high in the sky and I was far from the woods. But the creaking followed me. Even now, in the dead of night, when everything should be quiet, I hear it. Creak, creak, creak. And I know it's coming closer. It was early April 2023 when I decided to take a trip to Ruby Valley Campground in Nevada. I had heard it was a quiet, scenic place. A stretch of raw, untamed beauty nestled between the Ruby Mountains and the Humboldt Range. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was how deeply this trip would alter the very fabric of my understanding of reality. I pulled into the campground late in the afternoon, the sun slipping lazily behind jagged peaks. Shadows stretched long and crooked across the dusty ground. The air had a peculiar stillness, the kind that makes you glance over your shoulder, half expecting someone or something to be there. The campground wasn't crowded, just a couple of RVs scattered here and there. I parked my car near a picnic table that stood under a massive juniper tree, its gnarled branches twisting skyward like skeletal fingers. The table looked off. Its weathered surface was splintered and warped as if it had been sitting there for decades, enduring years of storms, sun, and snow. But it wasn't the age of the table that unsettled me. It was the way the shadows pooled around it, deeper and darker than they had any right to be. The dying sunlight touched everything else around me. Trees, rocks, even my car. But the table seemed untouched by it, as though it existed in a pocket of perpetual twilight. I brushed off the unease, convincing myself I was just tired from the drive. I set up my tent nearby and decided to eat dinner at the picnic table. As I sat there, the air grew colder, unnaturally so, and I noticed something strange. No birds chirped, no crickets sang. The silence pressed against me like a weight, filling my ears with the sound of my own breathing. Then, I saw it. At first I thought it was just a trick of the light, but as I squinted into the growing darkness, I realized there was a figure sitting at the far end of the table. It was barely more than a shadow, an outline of something vaguely human. My heart thudded in my chest as I stared at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The figure didn't move. I stood up, my legs shaky, and took a cautious step toward it. The closer I got, the more wrong it felt. Its edges were blurry, indistinct, as though it wasn't fully there. And yet, I could feel its presence, an oppressive, suffocating weight that made it hard to breathe. "Are you okay?" I tried again. No response. I took another step closer, and that's when it moved. Not in the way a person shifts or turns, but in a way that defied explanation. One moment it was sitting at the table, the next it was standing beside me. I stumbled back, my stomach twisting with fear. The figure had no face, no features. Just an empty void where a face should be. It radiated a cold so intense it burned, like standing in the heart of a glacier. I don't remember running to my car, but the next thing I knew, I was inside with the doors locked, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The figure was gone. Or so I thought. When I glanced at the picnic table, it was there again, sitting as still as a statue. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? I sat in my car, watching the shadow figure, my mind racing with every possible explanation. A hallucination? A prank? Some twisted product of my overactive imagination? But deep down, I knew it wasn't any of those things. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, I dared to step out of the car. The shadow figure was gone, leaving the picnic table looking ordinary again. But the air still felt heavy, charged with an energy that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I packed up my things as quickly as I could, desperate to leave. As I folded my tent, I noticed something etched into the wood of the picnic table. At first, it looked like random scratches, but as I stared at it, the marks formed words. "It sees you." My blood turned to ice. I drove away from Ruby Valley Campground that morning, swearing never to return. But even now, months later, I can't shake the feeling that I am being watched. At night, in the quiet of my apartment, I sometimes catch a glimpse of a shadow in the corner of my eye. When I turn to look, there's nothing there. But I know better now. It's still with me. I hadn't planned to stop at Baker's Hole that evening. It was supposed to be just another long stretch of highway, a casual drive through Montana's sweeping landscapes. But the storm rolled in faster than I expected, and the thought of navigating those winding roads under torrential rain was exactly appealing. Baker's Hole was a name I'd heard before a quiet campground nestled along the Madison River. Seemed harmless enough, the campground was almost deserted, save for a few scattered RVs that looked like they hadn't moved in months. Mine was the only vehicle that arrived that night. I backed into a spot near the tree line, the dense pines swaying ominously in the wind. As I killed the engine, the world around me went silent. It wasn't the comforting kind of silence you might expect in a forest. It was a suffocating, heavy quiet, the kind that feels wrong. Like the woods were holding their breath. I set up quickly, the rain already pelting the roof of the RV. Inside, it was cramped but cozy enough. The radio was still playing faintly from earlier soft static interrupted by bursts of some old country song. I turned the dial, searching for a station. But all I got was static. No music, no news, Nothing but that grating, whispering hiss. As I fiddled with the dial, something caught my ear. It wasn't the static. It was underneath it, faint, almost imperceptible. Voices. The accident the river took them. I froze, hand hovering over the dial. The words were distorted, crackling like they were fighting to break through the static. I leaned in, pressing my ear closer to the speaker. All of them gone. The voice wasn't clear, but it was enough to send a shiver down my spine. I turned the dial again, hoping to catch a station, any station. But the voices persisted, their words fractured and disjointed. Don't stay, it's not safe. My chest tightened. I told myself it was interference, maybe some weird trick of the storm. But deep down I knew better. Something about those voices felt off. I tried to shake it off, turning the radio off entirely. The silence that followed was somehow worse. I could still hear the faint hum of static, almost like it had seeped into the air around me. I busied myself with dinner, trying to ignore the unease gnawing at the edges of my mind. The storm outside grew fiercer, the wind howling like a wounded animal. Every so often, I thought I heard something outside, footsteps crunching through the wet gravel, a faint tap against the RV's window. I told myself it was the wind, but I avoided looking too closely. It was around midnight when I decided to turn in. The rain had slowed, but the storm's presence lingered, heavy and oppressive. I climbed into the narrow bed at the back of the RV, pulling the blanket up to my chin. Sleep didn't come easily. I woke to the sound of static. At first, I thought I'd left the radio on, but I hadn't. The static was coming from somewhere else, deeper, like it was resonating through the walls of the RV. I sat up, heart pounding, and strained to listen. And then I heard it. He's awake. The voice was low and guttural, almost drowned out by the static. But I heard it. Clear as day. Don't let him leave. I scrambled to my feet, flipping on every light in the RV. The static grew louder, a deafening roar that seemed to fill the entire space. The walls felt like they were closing in, the air thick and suffocating. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The static stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. My ears rang with the absence of sound, my pulse thundering in my chest. I stood there, frozen, every instinct screaming at me to run. And then I heard the knock. It was faint, almost polite. A soft tap, tap, tap against the RV door. My breath hitched. No one should have been out there. The campground was empty. The knock came again, more insistent this time. I stepped closer, my hands shaking as I reached for the curtain covering the small window on the door. Slowly, I pulled it back. There was nothing there. The knock came again. But it wasn't from the door anymore. It was from the window beside me. I turned, the blood draining from my face. The window was fogged up. Rainwater streaking down the glass. But there was something else. A handprint. Smeared and wet, slowly sliding down the pane. I stumbled back, my legs giving out beneath me. The lights in the RV flickered, and the static returned, louder than ever. "Leave now." The voice was right in my ear, as if someone were standing behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. The air was electric, heavy with something I couldn't explain. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I grabbed my keys and bolted for the driver's seat, not caring that I was still in my pajamas. The engine roared to life, and I threw the RV into gear, tires skidding on the wet gravel as I sped out of the campground. The static followed me. Even as I hit the highway, the faint hum of those voices lingered, weaving in and out of the crackling noise on the radio. I turned it off, but the static didn't stop. It was inside the RV now, inside me. You can't outrun it. The voice was faint, but it was there, just beneath the static. I drove for hours, not stopping until the sun broke over the horizon. By the time I pulled into a gas station, I was shaking so badly I could barely hold the steering wheel. The attendant gave me a strange look as I stumbled inside, muttering something about looking like I had seen a ghost. I didn't correct him. To this day, I don't know what I experienced at Baker's Hole. I've tried to rationalize it, blame it on the storm, or my overactive imagination. But deep down, I know the truth. Something was there that night. Something that wasn't human. And sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet and the static hums through the air, I swear I can still hear those voices. He's listening. People often say I have nerves of steel, a seasoned traveler who thrives on solitude and adventure. That was true until Fort Wilderness. I will never forget the cold, biting air of that November night. It was unseasonably chilly for Florida, and the campground had an eerie stillness, like the world was holding its breath. I had parked my RV in a secluded spot, away from the families and cheerful campers. I wanted peace, a place to think and escape the chaos of daily life. By day, Fort Wilderness is a beautiful place, tall pines, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, and wildlife quietly weaving through the brush. But as night falls, it transforms. Shadows stretch impossibly long, and the air grows heavy with something I can only describe as foreboding. It was my second night there when I first heard it. At exactly midnight, a sound cut through the stillness. Chime. It wasn't loud, but it was impossibly clear, ringing through the trees like a bell suspended in the air. My heart jumped in my chest as I instinctively glanced at the clock. 12 a.m. Sharp. I stood frozen in the dim glow of my RV's kitchen light, straining to listen for anything else. The chime came again. Chime. I opened the door to the crisp night air, my breath misting as I stepped outside. The forest around me was silent, unnaturally so. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just the lingering echo of that bell. Probably some kids playing a prank, I muttered to myself, though the words felt hollow. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. I locked the door, double-checked the windows, and tried to sleep. The next day, I explored the campground. Families wandered by, laughing and chatting, their kids running wild with carefree abandon. I envied their ease. I considered asking someone about the sound, but stopped myself. What would I say? Did you hear a phantom bell in the middle of the night? I would sound insane. That night, the chime returned, exactly at midnight. This time, it was louder, more insistent. Chime. Chime. I bolted upright in bed, heart pounding. It wasn't just a sound, it felt like it was calling me. Against my better judgment, I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the dense trees, but there was nothing. No sign of anyone. The sound came again, closer now. Chime. I spun around, my flashlight shaking in my hand. That's when I noticed something I hadn't before. The air felt wrong, heavier, like the atmosphere had thickened. I could feel it pressing against my skin, making it hard to breathe. I followed the sound, drawn deeper into the woods, past the marked trails and into the heart of the wilderness. My rational mind screamed at me to stop, but the bell, it wouldn't let me go. After what felt like an eternity, I reached a clearing. At the center stood an old, crumbling stone pedestal, barely visible in the moonlight. It looked ancient, covered in moss and strange carvings that I couldn't understand. And there, hanging in the air above it, was the source of the sound. A bell. It wasn't attached to anything, just hovering there, faintly glowing as it swayed back and forth. Chime. Chime. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my flashlight. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. This wasn't possible. Bells don't float in the air. Then, the temperature plummeted. My breath came out in thick clouds, and I felt a presence behind me. Slowly, I turned, and my flashlight beam landed on a figure. It was a woman, dressed in tattered, old-fashioned clothing, her face obscured by a veil. She didn't move, didn't speak. She just stood there, pointing at the bell. "Who are you?" I managed to choke out, but she didn't answer. Instead, she took a step closer, and then another. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, as if her body didn't quite work the way it should. I didn't wait to find out what she wanted. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, the chime of the bell echoing behind me. Chime. 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 It followed me all the way back to my RV. By the third night, I was ready to leave. I had packed up most of my things and planned to drive out first thing in the morning. But midnight came too soon. This time, the chime wasn't outside. It was inside. Chime. I froze, clutching the edge of the counter as the sound reverberated through the small space. My eyes darted to the clock, 12 a.m. My breath hitched as I realized the chime was coming from the bathroom. The door creaked open, though I hadn't touched it. Hello? My voice was barely a whisper. The light flickered, casting long, jagged shadows across the walls. And then I saw her, the same veiled woman, standing in the doorway, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. "You shouldn't have come here," she said, her voice hollow and distant, like it was coming from somewhere far away. I backed away, but there was nowhere to go. She stepped closer, and as she did, the chime grew louder, more frantic. My ears rang with the deafening sound. I don't remember much after that. Just a blinding light and the sensation of falling. When I woke up, it was morning. The RV door was wide open, and my belongings were scattered across the ground outside. I didn't waste any time. I threw everything into the vehicle and drove out of Fort Wilderness without looking back. It has been 2 years since that night, but I still hear the bell sometimes. Not every night, but often enough to remind me that whatever I encountered at Fort Wilderness hasn't let go. I have tried researching the area, looking for answers. Some say the campground was built on the site of an old settlement, one that was abandoned after a series of mysterious deaths. Others claim the bell is a warning, a way to keep people away from something darker hidden in those woods. All I know is that I will never go back. And if you ever find yourself at Fort Wilderness, listen closely. When the clock strikes midnight and you hear the chime, don't follow it. Whatever's calling you isn't something you want to meet. It's strange how the most tranquil places can betray you. I'd always thought the desert, with its stillness and vastness, was a sanctuary. A place where you could breathe freely and let the world fade away. That was before Camp Verde. Before the night, everything I believed about solitude turned into something I could never explain, let alone forget. I parked my RV at a campsite tucked away from the main road. It wasn't an official site, just a quiet patch of earth by a creek that had long since dried up. The February air was cold and sharp, and the horizon stretched endlessly under a sky so clear it felt like you could fall into the stars. I was alone, or at least I thought I was. I spent the first few hours setting up. The silence out there wasn't just silence, it was oppressive. No distant hum of traffic, no rustling of leaves, no chirping crickets. Just the eerie, all-encompassing void of sound. It pressed down on me like an invisible weight. By the time I started a fire, the feeling had begun. At first, I dismissed it as paranoia. It's normal, I told myself, to feel a little on edge when you're miles away from anyone. But it wasn't just the usual unease that comes with isolation. This was sharper, deeper, a sensation that crawled under my skin and whispered that I wasn't alone. The first time I saw her, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. I had been staring into the fire, watching the flames dance and crackle, when something moved in the corner of my vision. I turned my head, expecting to see a branch swaying, or maybe a shadow cast by the firelight. Instead, I saw her. An old woman standing just beyond the firelight's reach. She was still, impossibly still, like a statue carved from shadow. Her face was pale, almost glowing, framed by thin, wispy hair that clung to her skull like cobwebs. She wore a long, dark dress that billowed slightly in the breeze I couldn't feel. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling despite my attempt to sound steady. She didn't move. Didn't even flinch. I rose from my chair, the crunch of gravel under my boots sounding deafening in the silence. "Mom, are you lost? Do you need help?" Her head tilted slightly, just enough to make the gesture unnatural. Her eyes dark and empty fixed on me with an intensity that made my stomach churn. Then, as if someone had hit a switch, she was gone. Not gone as in she turned and walked away, Gone, as in 1 second she was there, and the next she wasn't. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the spot where she had been. My mind raced with explanations, one of them satisfying. Maybe it was a trick of the light, a shadow from the fire playing with my eyes. Or maybe I had nodded off for a second and dreamed her. But, deep down, I knew better. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was tired, that the isolation was messing with my head. I doused the fire and climbed into the RV, locking the doors behind me. The inside felt small and claustrophobic, the walls closing in as I tried to convince myself I was safe. I didn't sleep much that night. Every creak of the RV, every whisper of wind against the windows, made my heart race. Sometime after midnight, I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping. At first, I thought it was the wind rattling a loose piece of metal, but it wasn't random enough for that. The taps came in 3 step, tap, tap, followed by a pause. Then again tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the door. My breath caught in my throat as I sat up, straining to hear. Maybe it was an animal, I thought, though I didn't really believe it. I reached for my flashlight, gripping it tightly as I moved toward the door. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice cracking. No answer. Just the tapping. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I unlocked the door and yanked it open, shining the flashlight into the darkness. No one was there. But the ground was different. Earlier, it had been smooth, undisturbed dirt. Now, it was covered in footprints. Bare footprints. I slammed the door shut and locked it again, my hands trembling. Something wasn't right. I could feel it in my bones. I sat there, flashlight clutched in one hand, a kitchen knife in the other, waiting for morning to come. But the night wasn't done with me yet. Around 3 a.m., the tapping started again. This time, it wasn't just at the door. It was at the windows too, soft, deliberate, coming from all sides of the RV. Tap, tap, tap. It was as if whoever or whatever it was wanted me to know I couldn't escape. I crouched on the floor, trying to stay out of sight, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst. That's when I heard the whispering. It was faint at first, barely audible over the sound of my own panicked breathing. But it grew louder, clearer. A woman's voice, speaking words I couldn't understand. The tone wasn't angry or pleading, it was cold, detached, like someone reciting a list of facts. I clamped my hands over my ears, rocking back and forth, praying for it to stop. And then, it did. Silence. The kind of silence that's worse than noise because it feels like something is holding its breath, waiting. I don't know how long I stayed like that, curled up on the floor, too terrified to move. Eventually, the first rays of sunlight crept through the windows, chasing away the darkness. When I finally stepped outside, the footprints were everywhere, circling the RV in chaotic patterns. And on the window, scrawled in the condensation, was a single word. Mine. I didn't stay to pack. I didn't care about the campfire ring, the folding chair, or the food I'd left in the cooler. I got into the RV and drove, not stopping until I was miles away from Camp Verde. Even now, years later, I can't shake the memory. I've tried to rationalize it, to convince myself it was some elaborate prank or a vivid nightmare. But every time I close my eyes, I see her, standing there in the shadows, watching, waiting. And I know, deep down, that I will never truly be alone again. Yosemite National Park, June 2017. A place of untamed beauty, where the mountains carve into the sky and the air feels heavier, alive with the weight of centuries. I had been on the road alone for weeks, traveling in my RV, searching for something I couldn't quite name. Freedom, maybe. Or escape. But when I pulled into the secluded campground on the park's outskirts, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that settled over me like a shadow. The campground was almost empty, just me and one other RV parked at the far end. Their curtains were drawn tight and no one stirred. Good. I liked solitude, Or at least, I thought I did. The spot I chose was at the edge of the forest, where the towering pines formed a dark wall that swallowed sound and sunlight. It was perfect for a quiet night, or so I told myself. That afternoon, I decided to explore. The main trail was well marked and wide, but as I walked, I noticed something odd. About a mile in, a narrow, overgrown path veered off to the right, barely visible beneath the underbrush. It wasn't on the map, and something about it called to me, like a whisper, just at the edge of hearing. I hesitated. I am not the kind of guy who scares easily, but there was something wrong about that trail. The way the trees seemed to lean closer together over it, their gnarled branches forming a canopy so thick that the sunlight couldn't penetrate. It felt untouched, forgotten, as if the world had moved on and left it behind. Still, I couldn't resist. Curiosity has always been my downfall. As I stepped onto the path, the air changed. It was cooler, heavier, and carried a faint metallic tang, like blood or rust. The sound of the forest fell away, replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to press against my ears. My footsteps sounded too loud on the uneven ground, and I realized I was holding my breath without meaning to. The trail twisted and turned, leading me deeper into the forest. Time felt slippery, like I had been walking for hours, but the light hadn't changed. The trees began to look the same, blackened trunks with jagged scars, like claw marks raked across their bark. I thought I heard movement behind me, the crunch of leaves underfoot. But every time I stopped and turned, the forest was still. I told myself it was just an animal. Maybe a deer or a raccoon. Maybe. Then I saw it. A strange marking carved into one of the trees. A crude symbol, like an eye with jagged lines radiating outward. It wasn't the kind of thing nature did on its own. Someone had put it there. I looked around and saw another, and another. The same symbol repeated on the trees ahead, each one more jagged and uneven than the last, as if the hand that carved them had grown frantic. I should have turned back. I should have run. But something about the trail pulled me forward, like a hand on my back, guiding me deeper into the woods. The forest grew darker, the trees denser. The air was thick and damp, and the smell of decay hung heavy. Then I saw the cabin. It was barely more than a ruined wooden walls sagging inward, the roof half collapsed, vines crawling over every surface. It shouldn't have been there. This part of the park wasn't meant to have structures like this, not according to the map. I stood frozen at the edge of the clearing, staring at the cabin. The windows were black, empty sockets that seemed to watch me. The door was ajar, swinging slightly in the breeze, though I couldn't feel any wind. And then I heard it. A low, guttural sound, like breathing coming from inside the cabin. It wasn't human. My heart thundered in my chest, and every instinct screamed at me to leave. But my legs wouldn't move. The sound grew louder, closer, and I realized with a cold, sickening certainty that whatever was inside the cabin knew I was there. The door creaked open wider, and I caught a glimpse of something moving in the shadows. Not an animal, not a person. Something wrong. Its limbs were too long, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette pulled by invisible strings. I stumbled back, tripping over a root, and as I fell, my eyes caught the trees around me. The symbols carved into the bark were everywhere now. Dozens of them, and they were freshwood shavings littered the ground beneath them, as if they'd been made moments before. I scrambled to my feet and ran. The trail seemed different, twisted and unfamiliar, like it was leading me in circles. The forest closed in around me, the trees pressing closer, their branches clawing at my arms and face. I could still hear it, the thing from the cabin, moving through the woods behind me, faster than I thought possible. When I finally broke through the tree line and stumbled back into the campground, I thought I was safe. My RV was right where I'd left it, a comforting beacon of familiarity. But as I got closer, I saw the scratches. Deep, jagged gouges ran across the windows and the sides of the RV, as if something with claws had raked them over and over. The door was open, though I knew I had locked it. Inside, everything was as I had left it almost. On the kitchen counter was a piece of bark, fresh and damp, with that same eye-like symbol carved into it. I didn't stay the night. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw something standing at the edge of the forest, watching me. Its eyes were like the symbols, jagged and hollow. I never went back to Yosemite. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear that low, guttural breathing. And when I do, I swear I can feel the scratches on my windows,